Hello, this is the first in a series of recordings about the Ogham letters, where I'm taking it one letter at a time. There's already the introductory podcast uploaded if you haven't had a listen to that one yet. Probably logical to listen to them in order of sequence, as it were. So the first one we're going to start with is Beith, the letter B. That's the rubbish cardboard version. This is the, there we go, a bit closer, there we go. The much nicer version, which was made into an Ogham stave and given to me by Dr. Fisher, whom I mentioned in a previous, or the initial podcast. Each of these, incidentally, is made out of the wood in question, so this is made out of birch wood. So if we return to that cheesy old Blue Peter job, is that close enough? Oh, there we go. That I showed you in the introductory one. This is the first echma, the first set of 5 letters. And so we start at the top with the letter B, with Bay, the birch tree. If you haven't already gathered, the focus of these 20 odd podcasts is going to be on the more kind of mystic, magic, poetic end, rather than the pure, straight linguistics of understanding how the letters were used and the origins of words and language and so forth. We mentioned in that introductory one that there were 150 sets of Ogham listed in the book of Ogham. We're not going to go over all 150, partly because a lot of them are just so garbled and confusing we don't really know much about them, but I'm going to go over some of the more interesting ones and stick to the same, well, interesting to me that is, stick to the same set of things to go over with each of the 20 letters. So where should we begin? Well, we'll begin with the number of. I mentioned that they're numbered here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, all the way down to the very last letter in the sequence, which is number 20. So the number 1 is associated with the birch, with Bay. What do we understand of the number 1 in Irish mythology? Well, there are a couple of interesting one-eyed characters, and also characters who technically aren't one-eyed, but are often described as such for obscure reasons. So, for example, the giant Barlaw, who is the grandfather of Lugh, Lugh of the Light, the god of skillfulness and creativity and inventiveness and resourcefulness. His grandfather is this huge lumbering giant called Barlaw, who is the leader, the king of a race of villainous monsters in Irish myth. And he's quite weirdly shaped, this giant, because he has one ginormous massive eye and one ordinary sized eye. So he's often referred to as one-eyed, even though technically he has 2 eyes, but because one of them is so kind of massively disproportionate to the other. And this particular eye, which, to give you an idea of the size of the man's eye in the story, he's got sort of like metal iron rings through his eyelid, and there's ropes attached to it that can sling over the back of his head, and it takes 9 big lads holding onto these ropes to haul them, and the eye eventually opens. Why there's all this palaver about opening his eyes, that it's kind of like a, well, I suppose in science fiction terms we'd call it a death ray. It shoots out this beam of energy, light, whatever you want to call it, and whoever his eye looks at is slaughtered. It's literally like a laser beam coming out and kind of mowing down anyone that he looks at. And when he shuts his eye, the sort of laser beam effect turns off. And I'm sure if we wanted to go all a bit Eric von Daniken, we could interpret all kinds of weird science fiction-y symbolism about visiting aliens or something, and death rays and laser beams, but we're not going to go down that route. So the one-eyed giant, the one, is this destructive power of his eye, and it's got this rather negative undertone to it. There's also a somewhat more human-sized character called Gol McMorna, Gol the One-Eyed, who is kills off the father of Finn McCall in a jealous rivalry between the 2 warriors, and he takes over leading the Fianna, the band of warriors who for anyone unfamiliar, think a kind of like Robin Hood and the Merry Men, but Irish and much older. This kind of band of warriors who live in the woods and have adventures and all sorts of exciting things. So for a period, it's run by Finn McCool's father, by Cool himself, and then when he dies, it's taken over by Gol MacMorna, who has one eye, the other having been lost in battle somewhere, so he's just kind of scarred on one eye, very piratical. And eventually, Finn McCool at this point in the story is a child. He's taken off to be looked after in the woods, and eventually as a young man he comes back and reveals himself to have amazing skills and abilities and all sorts, and eventually displaces Gol MacMorna willingly, in a sense, because Gol kind of recognises his true quality, that this lad is the real heir to his father's power, and might be a bit of gritted teeth about it, but he reasonably graciously steps back from leadership of the Fina and pledges his oath of service to the son of the man he killed. So the fact that he's got one eye is not a massive feature of the story. It's just referred to sort of in passing that he is a one-eyed warrior. So is there a great mystical significance or poetic symbolism to his one-eyedness? Probably not, but it's part of this tradition of dangerous, risky characters who are one-eyed. Another interesting one is the Cailleach, the wild old woman of the mountains, who appears in both Irish and Scots Gaelic Highland mythology, and she is seen to either have only one eye, or in some versions she's got two eyes, but when she wants to work an act of magic, she stands on one foot with one arm kind of behind her back and the other one stretched out, one eye closed and the other one staring. So the eye, the finger and the foot are all on one side of the body, and the closed off bits are all on the other side of the body. And when she's in this peculiar stance, which is also referred to elsewhere in Irish mythology as the crane stance, crane as in bird, it's a position adopted by people who are usually about to engage in some kind of destructive act of magic, to curse someone or blast them or frighten them off in some way. So again, there is this, there is an undertone of menace about the oneness of what's going on. We could try to broaden that out and suggest that in a highly tribal society like Iron Age Ireland, the notion of being a hermit, of being alone, of being one, would have been very unusual, very odd. And when Christians came in with the missionaries, a lot of them favoured hermitage and taking themselves off to lonely rocks off the coast where they could sit there and get away from everybody and live in isolation. That may have been seen as very odd, very peculiar, that most people grew up at that time with very big families surrounded by brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and grannies and Lord knows what else. And therefore to choose to be solitary would have been highly unusual. May even have been regarded as a sign of either mental instability or of amazing power and the force of mind that someone could cope alone. So I suspect probably more the downside than the upside, because tribal societies are often very suspicious of people who want to get away from the tribe. It's seen as very kind of odd. So again, slightly negative undertones there. Moving from the number for the moment at least to the bird imagery, we're going to struggle somewhat with this because in the bird on the letter B is Basin, the pheasant, which as a bird is a relatively late introduction to Ireland, having come from other parts of the world. We don't necessarily know what bird it would have been prior to the introduction of the pheasant. Various people have suggested possible ones, but it's all just suggestion and guesswork. So we have this slightly later adaptation to a change in the local fauna with the introduction of the pheasant. And to be honest, the pheasants don't really feature in surviving Irish myth. There may be some myth that's sitting untranslated, written in Old Irish is now in the basement of some Irish university, getting covered in dust and waiting for someone to translate it, that involves a pheasant. But in terms of the ones that have been translated, there's just nothing. So quite what the pheasant would mean and how we should understand it from the period of history in which the arm was in regular usage is anybody's guess. We could look at how later cultures understand the imagery of the pheasant, but then that is later cultures and not necessarily the kind of mindset we're trying to think how would people have understood this back in Ireland when this alphabet system was being carved into monuments and written on parchment and what have you. So the bird one doesn't desperately help us, I have to say, on that front. There is the colour of Ogham, in which each of the 20 letters is represented by a colour. Not necessarily colours always in the way that we think of colour in this day and age, because it does include things like striped and variegated, which aren't really colours as we understand them nowadays. Transparent is another one, for example. But with the letter Beith, we have barn, white. There is another letter that is referred to as very white. So white and very white. If you go to a paint shop, a DIY shop, and buy a tin of paint, the kind of white you get is sort of eye-blindingly white. And with the invention of bleach and modern day detergents and so on, you can get cloth that is very, very, very white. But that's not necessarily what people in the Iron Age would have meant by a white cloth. So their definition of white might be more like what we would call cream in this day and age. And maybe very white, by contrast, was more like a bleached bone, something in that vein. So we might be talking more cream than sort of scrubbed bleach white. But it's an appropriate, given that the tree is the birch tree, which is silvery white. That is an obvious and appropriate and well-matched colour. White is one of the two fairy colours, coupled with red. So where an animal appears in Irish myth, and it is described as being white and red in coloration, it's an indication that this is a creature of the fairy realms that's wandered into the story and is about to do something strange and weird and magical. So there, with whiteness, there is this sort of magical undertone going on. The word for white, one of the other words for white, Finn in Irish or Gwyn in Welsh, as a person's name, Finn McCall or Gwyn ap Neath, their names not only mean white as the colour, but also blessed, holy, sacred. And so this isn't anything to do with racial politics. We shouldn't get bogged down in any of that because it wasn't relevant to this period of history and this culture. But the notion, which having just described to you the Gol McMorna and the Caliach and Barlow, the one-eyed giant, there's all these really rather scary figures. It might seem an odd contrast. We go from quite scary figures on the one hand to holiness and sacredness on the other. It's not actually necessarily a contrast, because holy, genuinely sacred people who are sort of plugged into the magical currents of the universe can be pretty bloody scary. They're not necessarily all cuddly and fluffy and lovely and genteel and walking on their own bathwater with shininess. They may be quite alarming sorts of people to encounter in many respects, and a very potent, raw, powerful force, the kind of force that could incinerate someone or restore them. Thinking there of the Dagda, the great father god who carries a club of iron, and one end of the club, if he bops you on the head with it, will kill you outright, and the other end of the club, if he prods your corpse with it, resurrects you to life. So it both kills and restores. And we've got that notion that great power can do both wonderful things but also terrible destructive things. So it can be a force that terrify the life out of you if you possessed it and you didn't know how to use it properly. But it could also, if you did know how to use it properly, be something wonderful and magical and make the world a much, much better place. So perhaps there is these sort of undertones going on here that the blessed and the white, the colour and the notion of holiness and the notion of scariness all kind of dovetail into one another in weird and wacky ways. What was that? Oh, yes. We have the three word oghams, which I mentioned in the introductory podcast. The sentence given by Macmorran, who was the judge of Bray, the sentence given by Angus MacColl, the god of love, and the sentence given by Cuchulainn, the great warrior of Ulster. So we'll go over each of those sentences. We'll stick to the English translation so I don't make anyone's ears bleed with my really bad Irish pronunciation. So going through the three in no particular order, we've got withered foot with fine hair, which can be seen as a straightforward description of the birch tree. You know, the fine hair are those very sort of dangling pendulous branches which from a distance kind of do look like very long hair. And the trunk of the tree, especially near the base where it tends to be quite swollen, and then the rest of the trunk is often somewhat slimmer and more graceful than the great lumpy bole of the tree. Does look like a sort of, you know, the base of the tree could be described as withered and lumpy and gnarled and so on. So withered foot with fine hair can be read as a straightforward description of a birch tree. Could be an allusion to a character. Easy to assume fine hair refers to a woman, because that's we tend to think in that way these days, but just as likely to refer to a male character. Many of the male characters in Irish myth are described as very beautiful, and you know, not only do they talk about the beauties of women, but they talk about the beauties of men too. So you can automatically assume something which is a flattering description. Fine hair is necessarily female. Who might that figure be? Oh, could be the Cailleach, who's described as having long, wild hair. And withered foot, well, you know, standing on one leg and being gnarled and ancient and old and knotted. Could be her, could be somebody else entirely. Another of the word-ons is greyest of skin. If that's a medical diagnosis, you're probably 3 steps off dead. If it's a description of the birch tree, again, well, grey, pale skin, silvery, greyest. The skin here being the bark, perhaps again just a fairly straightforward visual description of the tree. And the third one, beauty of the eyebrow, or sometimes simply beauty of the eye. So something which is beautiful to behold. And we do obviously have the modern English thing about beauty being in the eye of the beholder. That beauty is as much in the interpretation of the person looking as it is an objective measurable quality in the person, tree or thing, object being looked at. So perhaps beauty is something we perceive, and if you see beauty, it's as much something in you responding to what's out there as it is something which is objectively and definitely out there. So people who always see everything as ugly, that perhaps says more about them than it does about what they're looking at. And equally, people who see everything as beautiful, maybe that says more about them than it does about what they're looking at. We see out there what we tend to find inside ourselves, which may be an encouragement to look upon ourselves in a more positive light and kind of, if you see yourself as a more beautiful thing, will you judge others that you're looking at in a nicer light? If you look upon yourself in a very self-hating way as an ugly, awful thing, well, you tend to see everything else and everyone else as ugly and awful. And conversely, if you've got a more positive, upbeat view of yourself, will that tend to give you a rosier view of the rest of the world? Perhaps. Though clearly there are people who are very full of themselves, who have a very low opinion of everyone else. That happens. None of those three descriptions are necessarily giving us an enormous amount to work with in terms of imagery and symbolism and so on. One of the underlying ideas behind these series of podcasts is to start thinking about using the Ogham either in divination or as representations of magical energies which could be worked with in some shape, form or guise, in ritual, in meditation, in poetry, in storytelling, however else we want to use it. How do we build upon that? How do we utilize that? So starting to think in those ways. So if it comes up in a reading, that comes up in a reading. Is that closer? Oh, there we go. That's closer. You could go with the idea of a powerful force, something that could go to great good, but if mishandled, perhaps if it comes out upside down like that, upside down, something that suggests maybe the mishandling, and that's the more scary, one-eyed, blasting hag side of it, where something that could have been used for good has gone awry and been used for ill. Perhaps to focus on the idea of fair hair and fair skin and you know, beauty of the eyebrow and so on. That the birch tree is a beautiful tree to behold, and this signifies someone who is very beautiful coming into the life of the person you're doing the reading for. Or if you're using it in an invocatory sense, as a talisman or as an act of ritualistic magic or whatever, this is something you're trying to pull into your life. Those qualities, those traits of beauty and grace and fineness, of holiness, of trying to become more holy. Going back to the imagery of the number one, it's the first step upon the path, perhaps, towards holiness. And that can involve looking at the ugly things in yourself and dealing with them and getting rid of them, which would be quite a frightening thing to do, moving you forward upon the spiritual path. That could all be understood. Coming back to the original meaning of the word, the birch tree. A birch tree lives roughly the same length of time as a human being. There is a tradition in some cultures that when a baby is born, a tree is planted to kind of the health of the tree is the health of the baby. So if the tree goes big and strong, then the child or young adult, as they become in time, they're going to be big and strong. And a bit like that old song we used to sing in school. They used to kind of browbeat us into singing it about my grandfather's clock, which when it stops ticking, it's because the old man has died. And in that sense, the tree lives as long as the person. So when the tree kills over, the person kills over, and vice versa. In a lot of cultures, where they do plant trees, a birch is quite a popular choice to plant because of the fact that the lifespan is roughly the same, and the sense that the health of the individual is tied into the health of the tree. And these are they're not in wasteland. They're not the absolute first tree that grows on wasteland. Tend to get hazel trees and alder trees more likely to be the first ones to start seeding on wasteland, but the birch is quick to follow on that, so it's one of the first, but not normally the first to grow there. The birch bark is very papery and has indeed at various points in history been stripped off in sections and cut into sections, which doesn't do the tree much good, but there we go, and used to write messages on. It has the tendency to be a bit brittle over the course of time as it dries out and so on. So you wouldn't want to have a 10-year-old book made entirely out of birch bark, because every time you started opening it up, the pages would crumble away to nothing. But as a short-term message, as a kind of a sheet of paper, as it were, a sheet of writing materials at least, the birch can be written upon. It can be used to pass messages. And indeed, we're told that one of the first messages in Irish myth ever conveyed using the Ogham alphabet was done by Cuchulainn, the warrior, who took a length of branch, nice bendy branch, and wrote the letter B, wrote this 7 times. on the branch, so that the person who, the message was left to be conveyed to others, so that when it was read, it was a warning that the wife of the reader was at risk of being abducted by the fairy folk on 7 occasions, so 7 occurrences of the letter, 7 occasions, unless she was protected and preserved by the power of the birch tree. So obviously just writing the letter B, 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 B 7 times doesn't spell a word. Therefore we've got this idea that sometimes it was used just to write words, but also on other creations the alphabet was used to convey metaphorical messages. Now if, as an English speaker and reader, I were to see a piece of paper with the letter B written on it 7 times, that would mean bugger all to me, any more than the letter D or the letter K or the letter P written 7 times would mean anything. But there may have been a sort of a cultural understanding to do with number. One suggestion worth considering on this score is that we have this little nursery rhyme. I'm not quite sure how far back in time it goes, but a good few centuries. This little nursery rhyme that people learn about magpies: 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told, and on it goes. Perhaps in early Ireland, when these myths were first being heard, or at least first being written down, people would have known things like that. So they would have known, oh, 1 birch for this, 2 birch for that, 3 birch for something else. Likewise, maybe oak trees or hawthorn trees or what have you. And so the idea of 7 birch trees being meaningful to the person who looked at it would have made sense to the audience hearing those stories or reading those stories. And think, 7 birch trees, of course, that means the fairy is going to abduct you. Whereas 6 birch trees would mean something completely different. And 8 birch trees would mean something completely different, perhaps. But it makes sense. The first letter of the alphabet, the first message inscribed, is that why it's the first letter of the alphabet? Because it was the first message to be inscribed. A bit like the various Buddhist and Taoist stories of the Chinese zodiac as to why the animals are in the order that they're in, and that they had to run a race, and the first animal to pass the finish line, well, that was the first animal of the zodiac, the second animal, the second sign of the zodiac, and so on. Maybe at some point there was a story. Why these 20 letters? Well, the first letter became the first because of this story. The second letter became the second because of that story. We just don't know. It was nice to think there might have been myths like that at some point, but they've been lost to the passage of time, unfortunately. Back to the birch. We know various usages of the birch across different parts of Europe and other parts of the world, not specifically Irish necessarily, but kind of pan-European. So a not unpopular and somewhat gruesome usage of the birch was to take the very thin branches and bundle them up. On the negative side, to use them as a weapon to thrash people with. And on a somewhat more positive side, sometimes they were popular for making broomsticks, the bushy end of the broomstick. Heather was another popular one from that as well, for the sort of twiggy bits. But going back to the thrashing part, either for sort of thwacking naughty school children, or rather gruesomely for beating the mentally ill and for beating criminals. The notion behind a mental illness is quite similar to the working theory behind beating criminals, is that many cultures did, and actually some still do, believe that mental illness and criminal inclination are both caused by untoward spirits possessing individuals. So sort of not necessarily demons in the Hammer horror sense of the word, but troublesome, awkward, difficult spirits possessing a person and either sending them insane or making them more criminally inclined. And so the birch, bundles of birch twigs were used to batter them in the belief that it would drive out the naughty spirits and that individual would therefore stop being mentally ill or stop being criminally inclined. Kind of think if somebody bashes 7 shades out of you with a birch bunch, you'd probably stop being anything they tell you to stop being, frankly. I certainly wouldn't encourage this erstwhile government to start using that as a technique within the NHS to cure mental illness by knocking 7 shades out of people. But it's the sort of thing that has been done in earlier periods of history and is still, unfortunately, being done in some parts of the world, where quite rough treatment is used to cleanse people. And not always just people. If a building or a place was seen, or as an object was seen as being possessed in some way, often it would be thwacked about with birch rods too, to purge the spirits from possessing it. So kind of a driving out of unwanted presences to purify and to cleanse. So again, if you're looking for meanings to use in divination or in ritual or what have you, you might be grinding up birch bark for incense or something like that. Purification, cleansing, driving out. You can see that in the sort of almost like an exorcism. Avaunt, dark spirit, in that sort of sense. But giving birth is a pushing out of the infant from the mother's womb, because the mother's body has had enough of the child, and it's time for that child, in a very positive way, to be pushed out and start a new life. There may be parents of teenagers or young adults who would quite like to push said teenager or young adult out of the coziness of the family home to start their independent life in their own house, paying their own bills and all the rest of it somewhere else. So it can signify points in life where you're not necessarily exercising evil forces or anything as melodramatic as that, but where it's the time is up for the person to be in situation A and they need to be pushed gently or maybe not so gently into into a different situation, whether that is the child being born, the teenager leaving home, whatever else it may be, to get somebody out of situation A and into situation B. It can be a shifting force in that sense. There's an undertone of that going back to this idea of broomsticks sometimes being made with a bushy end out of birch twigs. We'll stick with an Irish example, although there are other examples from other parts of the world, but seeing as the Ogham is Irish. Dame Alice Caitella was accused of being a witch during the witch hunting mania, along with her serving maid, a woman called Petronella, and a few others. One of the things she was accused of doing, she was put on trial, the maid was executed, as is often the way of things when it comes to the working classes, whereas Dame Alice Caitella, who was very posh, quite wealthy, she legged it and was never seen again. So quite where she went, maybe Britain or France or somewhere, who knows, but she, by one means or another, escaped the horrible sentence of the court. But one of the things she was accused of doing was getting her broomstick and going round the town, sweeping all of the dust in the town to the front door of her son, who was grown adult at this point in time. Not because she wanted him to have a really dirty house or anything bizarre like that, but it was said that she was sweeping all of the good luck in the town away from everyone else who could have had their good luck, and sweeping the good fortune to the front door of her son, because she wanted him to have all of the good luck in the town, and using her magic broomstick to move luck from just kind of everyone's house to one person's house, to funnel it. We don't know what her broomstick was made of, so I'm stretching the point here of plausibility quite a lot. But you could read into that the idea that this is an energy, a force that moves things to where they need to be. It sweeps them along like the current of a river. It moves rocks in the river, or it moves good luck, or it moves maybe bad luck, or it moves any damn thing you want it to move from place A to place B. And therefore it can be utilised and harnessed as a force to move other things along to where you need them to be. There are various medicinal uses, minor medicinal uses of birch, but I think, looking at how long I've been waffling on for already on the timer here, that's more than enough to be doing with at the moment. Last thought I'll leave you with, and I wouldn't recommend trying this with every letter of the Ogham alphabet, because with some of them it'll be the last thing you ever do. But with birch, you can have birch wine. Tap birch sap from a tree and use it to make birch wine. Some of the Ogham letters are associated with plants that are consumable. And so one thing you could think of doing is not only using them in incense, but maybe culinary uses. So you're going to have a ritual in which you are calling upon a particular force. So I suppose you could have buy a pheasant from the local butcher shop and have that on the feasting table if you're an omnivore. Or you could drink toasts in birch wine and commune that way, or have one white candle going with the colour imagery and the number imagery, combining them upon the altar. You could chant the word bay, but maybe do it just the once. But stretch it out a bit, and stretch that out a bit as part of your ritual. There's all sorts of ways, imagery and ideas and associated traits and qualities can be combined into ritual, into meditation, into talisman making, into art, decorating things, into poetry, into storytelling, all of the rest of it. So it's just kind of using some of these ideas. And I'm sure there are plenty of other ways we could bring out imagery associated with the birch tree, particularly imagery from Ireland, Scotland, the Gaelic speaking lands, more than the bits and bobs I've touched on going along so far. So if anyone wants to suggest extra things, then we can always do a sort of a supplement to this later, or some written notes appended to the video file. But that's enough to be getting on with, and at some point, I don't know when, but at some point I'll sit down and do the second letter, Lush, and talk about the imageries associated with that. Okay, thank you.